Welcome to the Developmental Research Methods modules. In this next 5 modules, we're going to provide an overview of the research process in developmental psychology. 5 modules will be used to illustrate the various concepts. These include the scientific method in research, which we'll be looking over in the rest of this module, data collection methods, experimental research, developmental research designs, and attachments. In this module, we will be focusing on the scientific method and selecting a sample from the research study. The scientific method is the approach used to psychologists to systematically acquire knowledge and understanding about behavior and other phenomena of interest. There are several main steps to this process. The first one is to identifying a question of interest. You need to first find out what you want to ask questions about to find if it's relevant. Next, you formulate an explanation. These explanations are based on theories and hypotheses, which we will be describing in a little more detail on the next slide. And the third step is to carry out the research once we have designed it. And we use the research to either lend support or to refute our hypothesis or theories. You can see by carrying out the research, we need to make sure we operationalize the hypothesis. When we talk about operationalizing a hypothesis, we are putting things in very measurable terms. That way we can tell whether a hypothesis is a valid one or one that is refuted. Then we need to select a research method. We will be talking about research methods used in developmental research later in these modules. Next, collect data. And finally, analyzing the data to find out if your hypothesis has been found to be true. So, what exactly is a theory and a hypothesis? Well, when we talk about a theory, we're talking about a set of concepts and propositions intended to describe and explain some aspect of experience. Usually, theories are larger picture types of statements, and usually it provides an overview, but it's very hard to do research based on a theory. Rather, you need to form hypotheses that stem from those theories. Hypotheses are very specific predictions generated by the theory regarding a particular set of observations. So usually when you're starting with research, you go ahead and have your theory first, and that provides you the big overview, and then from that overview you create the specific hypotheses. So when we talk about most research, and as you'll see in your assignment, most of the research focuses on hypotheses that are made, usually based on theories that they put in their literature review. The literature review typically appears at the beginning of a study. Once we've gone through the scientific method and we've created a hypothesis to test, we need to decide who we are going to test that hypothesis on. And for that, you need a sample. A sample is a group of individuals being studied with the intention of generalizing to a larger population from which the sample is drawn. So in other words, if you want to go and do some research on adolescents, you probably need to go ahead and try to get an adolescent sample. The larger the sample, the better. However, we're not going to be able to test every single adolescent out there to prove our hypothesis. So as a result, we have to try one of several of the sampling methods that you're seeing before you right now. The first one is random sampling. It tends to be the best approach, and by this it's a sample formed by identifying all members of the larger population, and then by random means selecting a portion of that population to study. So, for example, it's like drawing the names out of a hat. If I had everyone in class that I wanted to measure their general attitude towards the way I present information, rather than ask every single person in the class, I would have maybe every 2 people go ahead and answer the questions. And by that, and the way that people sit, it would be a randomized type of study. And the reason it's important to have randomization is that it increases the confidence that the sample studied is representative of the larger population. Therefore, anything I find out with the smaller sample should be generalizable to the whole population. So I won't have to measure every single adolescent out there. Rather, I would have a random sampling of them, and then I could say these findings with a high amount of confidence will apply to the whole population of adolescents. Now, stratified sampling is a bit different. Here, participants are selected so that various categories of people are represented in proportion to their presence in the population. Now, this is very typical in national surveys and intelligence testing. So, for example, in intelligence testing, what we would do is to create a norm, we would need to have a population that we normed our test on that reflected the U.S. population. The best way to do this would be to go to the U.S. Census that provides a breakdown of all the different types of gender and ethnic backgrounds and mother's income, mother's education, father's income, and we would boil all that down, and so that when we were doing our testing, we would go ahead and make sure that this was exactly matched to the population of interest, in this case the U.S., United States, and the people that are in it. So that is a stratified sample. One other sample that tends to not be your ideal, but is also fairly prevalent in the adolescent literature, is opportunistic sampling. Opportunistic sampling is where participants are selected based on availability. Example would be conducting research in a school setting where only those students who had parent permission to participate were allowed in the study. The fact that only those who have parents that would sign off on the participation immediately has some sort of bias to it, so that these results are not going to be nearly as generalizable as they would if you did a random sample. Unfortunately, the way that most research is done, and to make sure that you do research in an ethical manner, sometimes the opportunistic sampling is the only one available to a researcher due to various requirements such as parent permission forms. Well, that pretty much concludes this first module. Just as a review, we went over the scientific method and also defined what a theory and a hypothesis was. Next, we talked about the different types of sampling, including random sampling, stratified sampling, and opportunistic sampling. Next, we're going to go and talk about, in our second module, the data collections for the hypotheses.